Pit stop check, we've got our snacks, and are ready to hit the road.
I'm here today with Kathleen Maca, author of Galveston Broadway Cemeteries. She's going to take us on a tour of the island's most famous cemetery. Let's go take a look.
Join Joe as he chronicles his road trips through the cities, towns, highways, back roads, and various regions of the Lone Star State. This is Texas Chronicles with Joe Perez. My adventure takes me to Galveston Island, where I'm meeting with Kathleen Shanahan Maca, the author of Galveston's Broadway Cemetery. I'm super excited to hear her fascinating stories about the island cemetery.
Hi, I'm Kathleen Maca. I'm the author of Galveston's Broadway Cemeteries, which is where we are today. We're going to take a look around the cemetery today and show you some of the things that you'll see if you come out to visit. When Galveston was first established, they buried their dead out on the sand dunes the way the Indians did. Obviously, it was problematic because during storms or high tides, the bodies would wash out and the wooden markers would wash away, especially during the yellow fever epidemics. The 1839 yellow fever epidemic alone, there were 250 people that were lost. So that year they decided to establish a city cemetery. And that city cemetery was Old City Cemetery, which is where we're standing now. It's the oldest cemetery within the 7 cemetery complex on Broadway. The Alberti family has one of the most poignant stories in Galveston. It's one of the only places that you'll find a murderess actually buried with her victims. Miss Alberti was married to a butcher in town, and they had quite a few children, were living happily, but she lost a son due to lockjaw, and then she lost a daughter when she was about 3 months old, and she fell into what we know now as postpartum depression, but people back then didn't know that. She was left at the home with 6 remaining children and her mother-in-law, while her husband would be next door at work at the butcher shop. And one day she invited the children to the table to sip a small glass of wine, which, although to our sensibilities today is strange, it wasn't that strange back then. She had poisoned the wine with arsenic, however. The oldest daughter was upstairs and she didn't hear her mother call, so she survived. The other 5 children were poisoned, and screaming in agony, their father came running to find them. By the time he called help, it was too late for 4 of the children. That's the first strange thing you'll notice about this stone, even though it's very plain, is that many of the death dates are the same. The headline the next day read 4 tiny coffins. The second to oldest daughter also survived. She was the only one that was poisoned and did survive. She and her sister are actually buried next to her parents. Elizabeth was taken to San Antonio to an insane asylum where she only remained a few years before she was returned to Galveston to live with her husband and her oldest daughter. But she couldn't take the guilt of realizing what she'd done, and she soon committed suicide as well. The one name that does not match on the very bottom of the stone is Elizabeth's sister, who also thankfully died before she witnessed all of this happening. You might be familiar with the ceramic portraits on some gravestones. This is when they used tintypes or actual photos, and you can actually reach in here and feel the glass that it used to be behind, but it's disintegrated, it's no longer there. This knob would have had some ornamentation on it, and it would have had a little flap that covered the photo, so when visitors came they could slide the flap to the side to see the picture, and then it would slide down to protect it. But of course over time the flap has broken and the picture has worn away. People consider me a tombstone tourist in that I visit cemeteries all over the place. I find them fascinating. I started when I was 12 years old when I was visiting cemeteries with my grandparents. While I was visiting my grandparents during the summer, at least one time during the summer, we would all go out to the different cemeteries around Oklahoma and visit family graves, and we'd learn the stories behind them. My grandfather, who was also an orphan by the time he was 5 and knew everybody in town, would walk me up and down the rows of the cemeteries and tell me stories behind each gravestone. That was old Mrs. Baker, and she used to make the best biscuits in town and would always leave me a warm one on the stoop for breakfast. That was Mr. Gilroy. He ran the livery stable, and he'd let me sleep in the loft in exchange for cleaning out the stalls in the morning. So I learned very early that they're not just names and dates on the stones, but there are stories and real people behind them. This is the grave of Elizabeth Percival, and she ran a restaurant and boarding house in town. Elizabeth was an immigrant from England, and she married a local barkeeper who was quite violent. He had 2 stepdaughters. She eventually left him, taking the stepdaughters with her for their safety, and established a restaurant and boarding house toward the Strand known as the English Kitchen. It was very popular, and she ended up having a wide range of friends. During Mardi Gras of 1881, she invited her friends out to the balcony of her restaurant to watch the parade, since it passed right in front of the English Kitchen. And her ex-husband hid in the crowd of the parade going by, shot her dead in front of everyone. So Elizabeth gets Mardi Gras beads every year as a remembrance. There aren't many records about Elizabeth because she was just an everyday person in Galveston. And the 2 stepdaughters that she left with to protect, there are no further records of them after her murder. It's my assumption that they probably changed their name and left town to escape from their father, since he was so violent. Most people expect a lot of ghost stories to be associated with cemeteries. Our Galveston Broadway cemeteries only have 1 associated with it. Not much is known about the background of Nicaragua Smith, but by the time he arrived in Galveston, he became notorious. He was known for bar fights and burglaries, armed robberies, and more, and he was eventually run out of Galveston. During the Civil War, he snuck back into Galveston and joined the Confederacy, where he was stationed out at Bolivar, but he decided he didn't like the rigor of soldier's life, so he escaped with a rowboat during the fog at night and went to the Union boats. Those boats were eventually captured by the Confederacy during the Battle of Galveston, and when the soldiers came ashore, he was immediately recognized by Galvestonians. He was tried and convicted, brought out into what was then the fields beyond Old City Cemetery. After his court-martial, Nicaragua Smith was ridden out to the field beyond the cemetery in what's now part of the cemetery. There was great fanfare, and a lot of the citizens came out in their buggies and wagons to watch the execution. He was asked if he had any last words, and since it was so full of expletives, it was not run in the local paper or any of the history books. He was shot and buried where he fell in what's now part of the cemetery, but his grave is unmarked because it was then just a field. He's thought to return every January 3rd, yelling expletives at passers-by. This is the monument to General John Bankhead Magruder, who was a general in the Civil War. He's credited with the victory for the Battle of Galveston. He was a Virginia native, a graduate of West Point, and he was known for his trickery. He would trick the other troops into doing things that they would end up cornering themselves so he could defeat them. He's buried here along with 3 other of his co-generals, and he was also known as a dandy in his time. They would have to hunt him down at dances. He was very tall, and the ladies thought he was very handsome, and he was always found on the dance floor if you couldn't find him. On his monument, which is really beautifully carved, on each side are one of these sections of the military. We've got the artillery here with the cannon, the cavalry with the horse, and the Texas Navy on the one side, and the riflemen on the back. So if you visit, please take time to walk all the way around and enjoy the carvings. This is also one of the stones that has been buried over time. So although you'll see his name at the bottom, Magruder, that's actually about 3 feet up on the actual monument. It's been buried that much over time through 3 grade raisings in the cemetery. Most people are familiar with the fact that the grade of Galveston was raised after the 1900 storm. But what most people don't know is the grade in the cemetery was raised 3 times up through the 1920s. So markers like this one of Franklin Merriman, who was buried in 1871, have actually had 3 grade raisings around him. They would run ads in the newspaper and say, if you can afford to come have your stone raised for your family, come do it. If not, if the family was gone or couldn't afford to, the stones were simply buried over. Obviously, a mausoleum was too large to raise, so the ground was raised over it, and what you're seeing now is simply the roof of his mausoleum. When we're talking about the grade raisings in the cemetery, Maria Raines is a perfect example. She was at one point almost entirely buried. When we were out here a couple of years ago for a cemetery volunteer cleaning day, the part that you see that's kind of discolored was all that was standing above the ground. So it just looked like part of a stone had been knocked off and was laying on the ground. With volunteer help, we dug out the section, being careful, of course, not to disturb anything else. And this entire beautiful monument was in pristine condition because it had been buried for over 100 years. We found the crown to her monument someone had rolled it inside her husband's mausoleum next door. So after the grade was put back, she was reassembled, and this is the first time she's seen daylight in over 100 years.
You can find Galveston Broadway Cemeteries by Kathleen Shanahan Maca at your local Barnes & Noble and Amazon.